Okay, hi.
Great.
Today we're going to talk about how to reduce violence in the world in warfare. In the year 2018, the world spent over $1.8 trillion on militarism, on military services and equipment and so on. And there's an awful lot of violence going on still. So there are things we haven't solved, and there are possibly better approaches to solving some of the conflicts in the world. So today I'm going to have a conversation with a man who's given a lot of thought to those issues. And this is Paul Maillet, who was for 33 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, or at least he started off in the Canadian Armed Forces. And after the Somalia fiasco, if that's the word for it, because there were some really bad things that Canadian troops did in Somalia some years ago, he was asked to look into ethics in military activities, and he went on to look at ethical issues in governance and so on. So since his retirement in about 18 years ago, he's been working in the Canadian on Canadian issues largely, but also overseas, helping other countries deal with ethical problems in governance. And of course, that's all related to some of the issues about what is the proper role of the military in producing security for people, and how can we reduce the amount of violence in the world, and also, I would hope, cut back on the excessive expenditures that are being funneled into military activities that really need to be spent on other global issues. So, hi, Paul.
Hello.
It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Now, let's see, why don't you give us a sort of a rundown on maybe the evolution of your own thinking and concerns as you tackled with some of these problems?
Well, I did start as an aerospace engineer in the Air Force, and as you say, became a director of defense ethics after Somalia. But the curious thing about my career was because I retired in 2001, which was about 6 months before 9/11. And probably for the whole bulk of my career, we did two things. We were either Cold Warriors or we were peacekeepers. And we had a number of missions, and Canada contributed expansively in troops and money, and shared in Nobel Peace Prizes and things like this in the domain of peace services. Just as I retired, and after I retired, there really was a shift in the military. From this peacekeeping and this Cold War paradigm into one of war fighting. This was the first time we got involved in missions and conflicts in which we took sides. Mm-hmm. And we did actively rather than trying to make peace. We were active in search and destroy missions, active in killing and military operations. Rather than doing that kind of that thing in a sort of defensive nature. So the military did change dramatically under General Hillier when he arrived, and became a war-fighting force. It has now, under the current government, withdrawn from things like bombing in Syria and doing these kind of war-fighting things, and trying to get back, as the Prime Minister has said, that we're back into peace and stabilization operations. The question is, what does this mean? And the question is it being resisted by the military? And in terms of as you said in your initial comments, the role of the military, and how stuck are we in the traditions of that kind of thinking, either the Cold War thinking or the World War thinking in the previous centuries. And what I've tried to do in some of my papers and conferences and things like this is to say that the traditional role, of course, of the military is embodied in the laws of armed conflict. And these are really a body of law in which have developed over probably 3,000 years and as a scattered collection of conventions and rules and laws, which kind of justify the use of military force in some sense, provide limits for the use of weapons and proportionality and things like this. And then at the very bottom of this, unfortunately, exhort us to minimize civilian casualties and non-combatants. What we have tried to do is say that this paradigm is probably no longer relevant, or is becoming obsolete, given the capacities of military forces now to do so much damage. I would have thought the lessons of World War II would have put a lot of this to rest. And in my view, what is now needed is a huge paradigm shift in which we actually invert the laws of armed conflict. So instead of starting with just cause and the presumption of death penalty and lethal force, we start at the very bottom, in which we stop the violence, we care for the victims, we get into negotiation, peace operations, and reconstruction and things like this. And then at the very end of the day, we end up with the justice and reconciliation, rather than trying to start with a presumption of that.
Aha.
And I think there is a foundation being built on that. I mean, we do have a lot of a collection of things, and we need probably internationally a fairly robust codification of some of these things that should be mandated absolutely strictly as a precursor to any justification for the use of the laws of armed conflict and military force. And, we've got R2P off on one side. We've got human rights conventions and various things that deal with peace that probably have to be paid more attention to, so that we're in the business of building peace rather than the business of making war when we face issues that have the potential for conflict.
Okay. Well, I don't think there's anybody who would. I hope there's nobody who would disagree with you. Now let's try to unpack it and see what it
takes us.
Yeah. Like, for example, I think the one thing that Canada has done lately is we did send some people to Mali, some troops to Mali, which is kind of the first effort that Canada has really made to do any peacekeeping in a long time. And whether I think they were flying helicopters around or something. Tell me, let's assume that we have a problem like the situation in Mali, or the situation with, say, the Boko Haram, or some of these other identity groups, I guess you'd call them, groups that are tribal in nature rather than ideological, I suppose. But certainly within many countries, the real wars that are going on tend to be that kind of thing. Now, how can we begin to approach that kind of thing? What kind of solutions do you envision?
Well, the first thing that I would envision, speaking of the Mali situation, is whether we are actually doing peacekeeping. I mean, it's a rather plug-in operation where we're doing medical evacuation or whatever, and transportation with regards to these helicopters, as opposed to dealing with belligerents and trying to make peace in some sort of sense. When you're dealing with other issues like Boko Haram and various situations that are in violence, like you're in either a pre-conflict, during conflict, or post-conflict phase. And the military has traditional roles in that, and there are traditional peacekeeping roles in that, say below the line, that Canada can be doing. And what we have to do is ask ourselves, which side of the line do we want to be on when we're dealing with a situation in any of these three phases? If we want to be in the peace situation, we probably have to do something in Mali that's going to involve probably 3 or 4 things. I mean, 4 things to be exact. We have to be present in the conflict somehow, but we have to be impartial. Unless we're able to talk to both sides, we're simply another party to the conflict. And there may be enough parties in the conflict that are dealing with the military force thing. And we ask, how could Canada contribute to this? I mean, if we want to contribute on the side of military force, then so be it. That's the decision. But don't pretend that we're actually in a impartial peacekeeping role there.
Mhm.
So we're present, we're impartial. We come with certain values there about stopping violence and human rights, and we have certain communication skills, relational skills, relentless diplomacy, and things like this that we're adding to it, and we're doing what can be done during for example, a during conflict role in terms of trying to do the diplomacy part, trying to do humanitarian aid, trying to look for refugees, trying to create safe havens. There's a variety of things that you can do until you get to the situation where you may be dealing with, negotiations and ceasefires, and then reconstruction and reconciliation, things like this. So Canada has to decide as a country what we want to do.
Would you say that anybody is doing real peacekeeping in Mali? It looks sort of like a war to me.
Well, that's the big question. Is this a civil war we're in, or is this really a peacekeeping operation as to what's going on?
Well, how do you
regards
tell?
To the French in there and the insurgents and the things that are happening. The notion of neutrality, not neutrality, but impartiality, and the role that somebody is doing that in there. I'd say that the situation is very blurry and very, very confusing.
Would you say there's anybody who's actually trying to listen to both sides?
Well, it is a multinational effort, and I'm not quite sure what some of the other countries and their contributions are on the ground with regards to trying to speak to both sides and trying to mitigate violence and look after these traditional peace operations that they can do. I am not 100% sure of that. I would think there is something. If it is a UN operation, then it has that domain embedded in it. UN peace operations have a civilian-led, multi-dimensional sort of peace capacity, which deals with a number of things: humanitarian aid and refugees, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people begin with the assumption, if you're really a peace person, you want to say, well, let's work on the problems upstream. That is, before they give rise to violence, and try to nip problems in the bud by foreseeing where there are conflicts over water or oil or land or material things. And sometimes I wonder nowadays whether some of the current conflicts really are over material things, and whether you can always count on being able to nip the violence in the bud by addressing those issues at the material level, because so much of it seems to be about religious affiliation or certain doctrines and that sort of thing. What do you think about that? Is there? I wouldn't know how do you go talk to ISIS, for example?
Well,
what kind of mediation or reconciliation, or what would you talk about if you went to see them?
Well, I think you have to change the whole context in which ISIS exists. You have to look at the fact that probably the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan were probably a precursor to the creation of ISIS. So you have that problem, and you have, whether you consider ISIS a military threat or just a criminal threat, in which apprehension and prosecution and criminalization of it, rather than this large search and destroy thing. But ISIS is a symptom of some malaise that's going on there. And if you look at it from a peace operations point of view, you had a chance to step back a little bit. You would say to yourself, what could have done in a pre-conflict situation here? How would we have made that country or those nation states or these groups in such a way that is going to have prevented the outbreak of violence in the first place? If we want to deal with ISIS in the during conflict thing, we may have to deal with the violence first, and that could be a very, very difficult problem. But we're working in another country where they've had a big civil war, and it has tamped down. And they're looking at creating institutions, for example, peace centers, because the violence is starting to emerge again. So you can do things like having a national action plan for peace and these kind of precursor things in peace operations that don't allow you to default to armed conflict all the time, because armed conflict is supposed to be a last resort.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's the only resort you have, then you're there all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to build these other capacities that are going to allow you to do something first. And a peace center that can go out into villages and do some education and create peace practitioners and national action plans for peace, community action plans for peace that might deal with ethnic or religious differences, or whatever the conditions are that are going to foment violence in if they're not looked at. So how do we face terrorism? Well, do we face extremism by waiting until it happens with indicators and that kind of thing and catch them and trying to either stop it or prosecute? Or do we try to build a village where a person may not be predisposed to that? The issues of either poverty or mental illness or jobs or hopelessness or whatever it is that would create these kind of things. The ISIS problem, we would try to solve it down the line, whereas we should have been doing things ahead of time. And we're in a during conflict response, where unfortunately, either the constabulary policing response or a military response seems to be what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we could talk to them, but wow.
Right. At this point, at a certain point, it's really hard to talk.
That's right.
If you were setting up an institution to just globally for the United Nations, let's say, and you had a big budget, let's say you took a good chunk of this $1.8 trillion from the military and really devoted it to trying to implement the kind of project that you would go about with trying to solve problems before they become violent. What kind of organization would you set up and involve people who are non-military early on?
Well, definitely it would be an organization in the domain of the non-military response. It wouldn't necessarily be a military-led thing. In our field kind of thing, there is the issue of negative peace and positive peace, as you're aware of. Mm-hmm. Negative peace is stopping the conflict, and positive peace is more the well-being, reconciliation, living together, that kind of thing. So what you've got to do is start right at the bottom with the individual. The community, the government, and then the international thing. With the sort of the principle that you must have peace within yourself before you can have peace between. Mm. I mean, I could easily solve transactionally the Israeli-Palestinian issues by all dicing up the map and making all of these agreements. There is a domain of negative peace and positive peace, and you certainly must have both. You cannot solve the transactional problem in the absence of a relational problem. As a matter of fact, if you can solve the relational problem, the transactional stuff usually solves itself. An illustrative point.
The hardest thing in the world is solving relational problems.
Yeah, for example, there's a Zulu, what's called a Zulu method. And if they have a problem between tribes or whatever, they get together for 2 weeks. And the first week and a half, they party, go on trips, talk, share family stories, sing and dance and whatever, for 80% of it. And then the last 2 days, they get together to solve the issue. So what, in fact, they have done is they've become human beings to each other rather than competitive objects to either be defeated, destroyed, or whatever. And that kind of thing can emerge. So there is the notion of positive and negative peace. And the other construct would be peace within before peace between. In other words, you have to come to that table with nonviolent communication, various language, and an outlook, and a way to articulate who you are as a human being before you can expect to have that relationship. So if both sides can do that separately, and then we have a meeting, we're not in the position of just refereeing the conflict anymore. We're in a position of trying to get them to relate. And the relational part should solve a good part of the transactional issues that emerge.
Yes, but it's the hardest thing in the world, Paul. I mean,
it is.
just look at people's families. You
Yeah.
know, how many families do you know where there's no friction and no estrangement and nobody hates anybody else? I mean, practically every family I know has either mental illness of some kind or mental disorder, or estranged relations, and people would do their best to heal these. I think almost everybody would like to, but boy, it's hard. I think for me, frankly, changing social institutions is a piece of cake compared to changing another human being or even changing myself. You know, my soul is a real morass of dirty, ugly, painful, unpleasantness. And I think most people have a lot of that too, and that's the way it's going to be. So, but you can make people behave themselves with a sufficient, incentives and regulation and whatnot. So I just plain don't go in for trying to change people as a precursor to doing peace work. It just seems to me a totally self-defeating thing.
Well, one of the premises of peace work is that there must be a readiness and willingness. I mean, you're either into a situation where the conflict has gone on to such an extent that you're just exhausted and you can't live this way anymore. The job of the peacemaker in being present there is to be able to sense that point. And when these people are ready, then he's going to take all that kind of advantage. And you're absolutely right. There's nobody on the planet who hasn't encountered suffering in their lives and their families, that kind of thing. But maybe the human project here is how to develop practices to respond to that in some way, which is going to define either the best of human existence or at least how you want to do it. And this is an issue of practices. And as the saying goes, some days it's going to work well and some days it's going to be an unmitigated disaster. But if we come at it from the point of view of an expectation approach, we're bound to fail. If you take the example of, say, crime, and our mission is to eradicate crime, we're going to fail every day. And we know that human nature is going to continue this, and suffering, etc., is going on. But if we take an approach,
crime rates do vary. Sometimes we have, and some places are a lot less crime.
Well, this is the second part of the argument. The expectation may be leading you to failure, but if you take another approach, that's going to be a response-based approach. In other words, we get up every day and we work at it. The courts work at it, the police work at it, and we personally work at it. And even though we're only one person, we don't refuse to do what one can do. And that capacity to be able to respond to the problem and the daily suffering and whatnot has a measure of sufficiency and not always a measure of failure. I mean, there's a mindset that probably has to happen, in which, for example, that you can cultivate some practice of calmness and equanimity and compassion. There are some philosophies that say, how does one live well? How then should we live? With those that we love and everything that goes on, we can live with gratitude and sympathetic joy in their happiness, and we can also live with calmness and equanimity. Now, those from which we have differences, if we're able to step back a little bit and say maybe we deal with them with compassion, sympathetic understanding, and then again with some sort of calmness and equanimity. Now, this is a practice that has to come into consciousness. I mean, otherwise, You are always going to be a victim of this suffering or everything that's going on, rather than have some agency in responding to it, that defines yourself as a person, as a human being. So you start with the individual, and as Gandhi said, my life is the message. How I'm going to live with my life is going to be the message around me, and that can be infectious. So there's that construct that can happen at the individual, community level, and I realize that as we get up into the global domain, you become more and more powerless. I mean, global government is not a powerful government. There's not a world government with a world police force or military force that has the power to do much. And
but don't you think that's where we have to put some energy in creating some of the institutions that can handle things through at least legal structures and organized projects? I don't know. I mean, it looks like you and I are at the opposite ends of a particular continuum, because obviously you're good at working with people's hearts and souls, and I just plain take sides and I get mad at people. I could not be a mediator whatsoever, because I immediately see whose side I'm on, and it shows, and I get mad sometimes. So, but there are things that I think that can be done even by mean people like me, who get angry. I mean, I think of setting up safe zones, for example, for people who are victims, taking care of victims
and protecting them. Yeah.
And protecting them, yeah. I think there's room for somebody who has my failings and or shares some of the failings that I have. No?
Yeah. I wouldn't put it that way. I mean, even us on this side of the coin recognize that what we're trying to do is get a better balance. The ethic of justice, where you want all of the policing and the force and the use of force and that sort of thing, has a place in all of this. But what we're trying to say is, and I think what you have said yourself, there's X trillions of dollars spent here. How much on the other side of the coin with regards to the ethic of care and peace? Mm-hmm. And what do we want to do as Canadians? How do Canadians want to contribute to that? And do we want to develop great big large armies that are going to go in and do that kind of thing? Or do we want to do the peacekeeping, the peace building side? There are two philosophies here that I recall. Once we went to Carleton University there, and they had a Western and Eastern philosophers, and we only had one question: how does one solve a moral dilemma? A moral dilemma, an ethical dilemma. And on the Western side, it was fairly easy. It's the ethic of justice. Comparative harm and neglect. On the other side of the coin, they said, well, have we thought about peace and harmony? And as a probably something that's very important when we're solving these moral dilemmas. So what's the highest ethic we have as human beings? The ethic of justice or the ethic of care? Carol Gilligan, Kohlberg, those kinds of things. And how do we balance them? That's basically what we're doing, and I guess I find myself on this side of the argument a lot because of the other side of the argument has such a preponderance of trillions of dollars and activities and everything that's going on without a whole lot of reflection or balance. And I'm not saying that we, if we get angry at something or we're shocked by something, of course we all are. But how do we respond to that? That's the question. Am I going to be a victim of that emotion that's in my mind here, or am I going to use that in some positive way and look at it?
Yeah, clearly there are times in a conflict or opportunities for that kind of reconciliatory approach, but if we look at any one conflict in the world today, or take let's say the government of Saudi Arabia. I know which side I'm on. I want to get rid of that regime. Uh, and I want to, and I know which side I'm on when it comes to Yemen and which side I'm on in Syria, and I know that I'm in favor of the Rohingya, and I want to compel this somehow the government of Myanmar to treat them better, and so on. So I'm clearly on one side. I feel, there's been violations of human rights, and I need to protect people from an oppressive regime, or sometimes from some other source within the country. Going in and I don't know. Let's take the Rohingya. If you want to protect those people now, given the immediate situation, how do you protect them?
Well, the premise of your argument is you have a side on this, and even a peace professional who's impartial, or a judge in a court, for example, has to set aside some fixed views while he is responding to this. Mm-hmm. And you've got to say to yourself, it's not what I would like to do in this situation. It's what can I do? Mm-hmm. What can I do to make this better? And if it is an issue of protecting the Rohingya and people like this, why weren't we in there with massive expenditure of resources and whatever, building camps, safety, that kind of thing? And the ethic of justice will come in due course. But I think the first important thing was to stop the violence against the Rohingya. And one could have gone in there in some sense, in some capacity, in setting up a camp or a safe haven or whatever, and did that protection. Now, the other side of the coin that you bring up,
and maybe you can't. I mean, take China right now with the Uyghurs. Now, right. They're not going to let us go in there. There's power in this world. Certain countries and governments have power. So I think, honestly, I think the problems that I see are, when we get to a point where there's violence or there's total abuse of human rights, and then's when we have to take action. We don't necessarily see it coming. Nobody saw the Uyghur thing coming, as far as I know. Maybe we could have seen the Rohingya thing going, I don't know. But foreseeing it in time to actually do the right things in order to prevent it is certainly the way to go if we can do it. But now that we really have the problem, what are we going to do about it?
Well, at the beginning part of your argument is valid. I mean, did we have a peace center that's looking at monitoring these things and asking ourselves, what can we do in a pre-conflict stage? I mean, China is very, very powerful, and that part of the country is very, very isolated, and it'd be very difficult. The use of force would cause catastrophic death in the kind of thing. So you're up against the law of marginal utility, where the more you do in that domain causes more harm than good.
Okay, I agreed on that. And for example, the ISIS thing, a lot more civilians have been killed by the invading, people fighting ISIS than ISIS killed. And
well, that's right.
It clearly was not a good strategy for saving lives. And I suppose that's true in almost every violent conflict nowadays. Anyway.
You've got something what's called an RMA. For example, in fighting ISIS, these bombing campaigns were very, very, very destructive. Not only in leveling cities, but in killing civilians, and probably causing more harm than they alleviated. Now, that's a question of the laws of armed conflict and what they should have done. And you're absolutely right. I mean, when you're in those kind of situations, you have to take more risk. In other words, the soldier is trained to protect himself, and he has all sorts of armor and training and standoff weapons, but civilians do not. So that you cannot indiscriminately put them at risk. And part of the laws of armed conflict is to is to try to avoid civilian casualties pretty well at all costs. They did not do that. I mean, there was something seriously wrong that happened there, and that it should have been the military who was taking the preponderance of the risks rather than the civilians. Mm-hmm. And this has happened throughout warfare. I mean, originally in warfare, if you're fighting with swords, you did not have a lot of collateral damage. You were engaging the combatants almost directly. So probably most people killed in those kind of battles were soldiers. Well, the opposite is now true. The soldiers and drones and airplanes and armor and all these standoff weapons probably are now starting to kill more civilians than actual combatants. So something has to be looked at in terms of what they call RMA, the Revolution of Military Affairs, and the way these things are going with regards to autonomous weapons and whatnot. And the world has to pay a lot of attention to that. But on one side of the coin, if you can decrease the likelihood of conflict through peace operations, you hopefully will not use those things unless you're a very, very, very last resort, and probably in defense of your own homeland. Mm-hmm. But it's a very, very difficult problem.
Okay, look, you've been working in even the term ethics is not something you normally come across in relation to military matters, and you've been off doing things in other countries. I don't know whether you can talk about these, but you've been helping other countries set up systems for implementing better ethical procedures. Can you talk at all about that?
Well, sure. In the background, when you have an intractable situation or an intractable question, how does one then respond? And it's probably in the meta environment around that question. So you work those questions in hopes of solving the big one or eventually getting to address it. One of the projects we did was in Tanzania. Through GAC, and it was to install an ethics secretary.
What is GAC?
Global Affairs Canada.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah, used to be CEDA, Foreign Affairs, International Development Projects. Mm-hmm. They do peace and stabilization things in a office of the president in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and Tanzania was, I think, 113 or 114 on the corruption index. So the corruption was eye-watering. And they wanted to say, look, how can you get at these 10,000 elected leaders and civil servants and whatnot? And our response is that we're not going to get anywhere by reading conflict of interest regulations and fraud and this and that and trying to catch them and throw people in jail as a strategy. We have to deal with everybody around these leaders. So we had to go to the business community and talk to them about social responsibility and bribes and Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We had to go to the education system and say, how are you going to put this in lower schools, middle schools, universities, about ethics, peace, resiliency, trauma, all this kind of thing. You have to go to the people and say, look, if you want honest politicians, you got to vote for honest people and go to the police, and then the civil service and disclosure systems and reprisal protection systems. So everyone has to grow together. You can't just isolate ISIS, for example, without thinking of everybody around them and what needs to be done. And so that was 3 years, and some work in Iran with the Faculty of Law that's in Tehran, trying to look at a codification of peace operations as a precursor to military operations, laws of armed conflict.
How that would be a codification of peace operations.
Yes, we have a codification of the laws of armed conflict. If we had a codification of peace operations, which have a strict mandate to be considered prior to any justification for the use of the laws of armed conflict. So there was discussion.
What would that look like? Can you? My imagination kind of goes blank.
Well, the laws of armed conflict, as I stated before, is really a collection of conventions and various laws, ICC and things like this. Mm-hmm. And the laws of peace operation are somewhat scattered. And so if they had to do things, R2P, responsibility to protect, various things that to stop the violence, mediation, building peace centers, pre, during, post-conflict things that they can do, similar to the military doing things in pre, during, and post with regards to military operations, that you're giving yourself more options. And
making any progress with that? I mean, I haven't heard about that.
yeah,
It'd be like developing new international laws regarding procedures that should be done before military action, right?
is legitimate, is justified, and it's not about, in a lot of cases, not about developing it, but bringing together what we have in some sort of critical mass that's going to make it compelling, and then you can have certain laws in there that's going to mandate these things. I mean, we already have declarations of rights and freedoms and cultural rights.
I'm wondering whether that could be kind of incorporated into or made a protocol or something of the responsibility to protect doctrine. Because, you know, that doctrine it has so many positive attributes that one you know can help being in favor of it, but at the same time, you know, it almost came and went very quickly as a legitimate international procedure or law or a norm, because I think it was so badly implemented in Libya. You know, that situation where I guess it was invoked as a responsibility to protect kind of operation. I don't know, but details, I remember thinking, boy, this is pretty good evidence that they need to do some more work before specifying what the responsibility to protect has to look like and what form it should take. It should not go in and be a war against one side rather than another.
Well, that's right. It was
Protection is just not the same thing as fighting on the same side as.
That's right. It fell out of the Rwanda genocide. That was the big impetus for that law, and it was somewhat misused and corrupted in Libya. Although it started out that way. I mean, initially they wanted to prevent loss of life, but the next thing you know, they were taking sides, and there was a regime change issue in the picture. And no-fly zones became war zones kind of thing. And I think the Arab countries were aghast at the way this turned out because they thought it would be different.
I remember when it was going on, I thought, well, because there was real good reason for some kind of intervention. You had Gaddafi saying that the people in Benghazi were you know, like rats, and we were going to go and exterminate them, go door to door and kill them all. And this was a real threat. So, I mean, I thought if you'd send in peacekeepers and interpose them between, you know, these two forces and say, okay, guys, put your guns down. You're not going to kill each other. We're not going to let you do that. Now we'll have a ceasefire and you got to settle this.
That's right. It could have been done a lot differently. The objective then corrupted itself, and the next thing you know, there was a massive bombing campaign of just about everything, you know, around the Gaddafi side of the coin. And you're right. When one protects somebody in a sort of defensive operation, is the moment the violence stops, you stop. You don't just get into this search and destroy mode. It's a you know, it's serve and protect. It's more of a constabulary philosophy that's used.
Yeah, I don't foresee a time when we can get along without having police force in our cities, for example.
Oh, never. Yeah, we'll never get rid of them. It's the whole premise here is balance. That we are not balancing the ethic of justice with the ethic of peace and care. That's
okay.
That's the premise, and that works its way all the way up from the individual to the global community.
Mm-hmm. So I think maybe a potential global initiative to reduce militarism and to shift the burden of taking care of security as well as protecting people should shift materially and significantly toward the international level, that is the UN. But again, now the UN is controlled by the Security Council, which is definitely not an impartial outfit. So how could we transfer the responsibility for protecting people more and more to the international bodies, at least multilateral bodies, and I think the UN, and do so while it seems to me we've got to do something about this, changing the UN governance itself in order to make it more accountable to the whole population of the world and not just to the P5, let's say. So here I am telling you what I want you to say.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. One of the issues I would bring up is if your contention is we're asking states to surrender some kind of sovereignty or capacity or whatever to some central body, we're missing the point that central body is the states. All the states are what would make that happen in the fullness of time. So you have the issue of as global governance sort of gets to a pyramid. If you put too much power at the top, you're just going to get another corrupt people are going to come in, good people are going to come in. This is going to swing back and forth as anything that happens. The United States is here, Trump comes in, now it's off in another direction. And the more power that you concentrate on the top, the more those kinds of political issues will start to emerge. So some of the theories of global government is that at the top you have to make it as powerless as possible. And that way you're going to deal with these kinds of issues. You're going to deal with them in terms of a consensus in principle. In other words, the Rohingyas are in trouble, or this is kind of conflict there, and we as a collective body think something has to be done, and that it can only be done by some coalition of the willing. So some people have to step forward. If nobody steps forward, then that's who we are as human beings. You know, we don't want to deal with that, and we have to accept that responsibility. Rather than trying to abdicate that to a United Nations power structure and blame them, when it's actually us to blame. You know, that we have created the problem and we're blaming someone else. So there is an issue that needs to be resolved, and collectively, if we really believe that, we need a coalition of the willing to be able to take that UN resolution or declaration or whatever and act on it. Now, you're absolutely right. The Security Council probably has to change, whether you want to dissolve it or not, or what you want to do, or have rotating memberships. But therein could reside people who want to be in coalitions of the willing to deal with problems. And naturally, the more powerful country.
Getting rid of the veto would be a great step forward, I think. But also, I would say, because the UN itself is really not accountable to people, they're just, as you say, the members are states, and
states are people.
But they're not real. I mean, lots and lots of countries are in no way democratic, and even those that are. True. I mean, look at Canada. We've got our own problems sometimes, or the U.S. has it even worse now. But I think part of the democratic deficit in the UN could be solved by having a parliamentary assembly where we have, population votes delegates and deputies to the assembly. Even so, I don't know how far you can go with that, but it would make it more trustworthy, it seems to me, that you could maybe believe that the UN will take care of you if you're willing to surrender some of your military power and turn it into SDG, expenditures on sustainable development goals, or other necessary things. And if you'd be willing to, as a country, make that kind of shift, you need to know that somebody's going to take care of you if the bad guys come and invade. And I think the UN, its original mandate was to protect people, but
we There is a parliamentary dimension to this in the General Assembly. I mean, here we have everybody, and that theoretically, whether these are good actors or bad actors, represent 7 billion people in some way, shape, or form. And you're absolutely right. I mean, you're going to get human nature. Your cross spectrum of human nature exists in the General Assembly, from dictators on down. But at the end of the day, civilized people talk. And the United Nations is a place there where you can get together with all of these people and try to work things out. I realize endless talk and a lot of these things are very, very frustrating. It's going to be extremely difficult to give up military forces and whatever, when main threats to them might be their neighbor. And to count on the United Nations to step in to defend them is a real issue in insecurity there. So I guess the question is, what can be done? Certainly, it's like in Canada. I mean, they promised electoral reform where, 35% of the vote gets 100% of the power, and that didn't materialize. But those kind of reforms may be possible in the General Assembly, where other votes, in addition to national votes, can decide on the basic resolutions, which is the will of humanity in a sense. And once you've got the will of humanity expressed, the question is, okay, how then are we going to carry it out? And where is the consensus of the willing? To me, you've got to take the veto power out of the Security Council. I mean, that has to go. And a clear majority, 60% or something like that, because it's paralyzed.
You really can't take it away from them. They're not going to let go.
This is where this reform has to happen.
I know. Well, look, I mean, I think the General Assembly has a much better record in terms of actually making good policies, although I've never, but it is the members are states and not citizens. No citizen votes for a representative at the UN directly, and a parliamentary assembly would be eventually some version of direct election. I don't know how much improvement that would make, but something has, I think, be done to establish the reliability of the UN as a source of protection. And I don't think it's there now. I think nations send in armies and troops to take care of whoever their friends are, and that's about the size of it.
Well, you're right. When a country makes a contribution to the United Nations, in the background is national interest. You're absolutely correct. And in Canada's case, I mean, Canada is an export nation, and our military very, very small. We couldn't stand up to half the militaries in the world. But our protection and our security is the 3 oceans we have around us and a benign neighbor. We're very, very, very lucky. But our security and our economic prosperity is 100% dependent on the security and the economic prosperity of the world. I mean, if that collapses, we're in big trouble. So that begs the question of how Canada should contribute. And it should contribute in the nature of economic prosperity and peace and stability in the world, because that's the peace and stability of Canada. We should not fool ourselves that if the international order collapses, that we're not in serious trouble.
Well, I think, though, I mean, it's true. I don't think Canada's one of the worst countries, although it's not great in terms of the amount that we spend on military. A lot of countries do worse, but I think every country should be looking to divert some of the national military expenditures to exactly solving problems, so to speak, upstream. The investment in solutions that bring tranquility before violence begins to emerge.
That's right. There's no shortage of military expenditures in the world. What there is a shortage of is expenditures in the domain of peace operations. That's what the shortage is. And we shouldn't always equate peace operations as a military-led thing. It should be a civilian-led thing, and the military should be a subcomponent of it that's going to deal with protection, defense, stopping violence.
Yeah.
That's it.
Is there any place where that's the case? Is there any country that does invest reasonably in the kinds of operations that you would advocate, and where their peace operations are largely managed by civilians?
Well, there are some small countries, Solomon Islands and I believe Costa Rica, that have no standing army. It is a Department of Peace or some institution of peace that looks after that domain. I mean, there's an organization called GAMIT, which is a global organization or association for ministries and infrastructures of peace. And the idea is that to build these kind of ministries in that, so that you can spend less on the military side. And I think there has to be some kind of trend in that particular way. Development of national action plans for peace, something deliberate that's going to happen. You know, accreditations for peace professionals, civilian peace professionals who can do a lot of these things.
I think maybe what you're saying, it all makes sense, and I haven't ever heard anybody put it forward as a particular set of proposals, you know, a global action plan for how to make that kind of transformation. I'd like to see that happen. In fact, I would like for you to write up something about how we could do that. And in fact, I would love to have you put it on to the platform for survival. That you know, we have a 25 planks in our platform for survival, where we're trying to find ways of preventing 6 global threats, and certainly war and weapons would be one of them, and the transformation into a security structure that is sustainable and humane that you have described. I think we need to spell that out more, how we're going to get there. So
well, we have started an initiative. It's a national action plan for peace, and we've asked people one question: what's the one most important thing you would like to see in that? And we're trying to build a dialogue up into September as a precursor to the federal election coming up. And we've got people in various cities across Canada that are going to ask this question of either candidates, MPs, or just ordinary citizens, put something together, and then draft some kind of national action plan in the same sort of format that we have for National Action Plan for Women and UN 1325. So what would we like to do? We'd like to have a conversation on this, and asking MPs and candidates what the one thing they would like to see in there, and we'll see what comes out.
Now I can say goodbye. This has been terrific, and I definitely want to follow up with what we've just been talking about, because I think maybe that's something we should put on our platform.
Thank you, Metta.
All right, thank you, and we'll be in touch.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.